Chapter 10. The Parent Boomers. The truth is this. Your parents had sex, opted not to abort you, and that's why you're here. You didn't have a say in whether you'd be here or not, nor did you get to determine who your parents were. It was their choice, their decision, and thus 100% their responsibility. Raising you was 100% their responsibility. But this responsibility isn't something like being a boss boomer and owing it to younger generations to write an honest job description. Nor is it like being a professor boomer whose guilt inevitably forces him to level with his students about the unemployability of their liberal arts degrees. It's raising a human being. It's preparing a sentient, conscious human to be able to survive in the real world. It's taking an innocent, completely helpless infant, feeding it, bathing it, raising it, and training it so that it may not only sustain itself in the real world, but ideally succeed and thrive. There is no more important responsibility in the world than raising the children you decided to bring into existence. And it is the ultimate responsibility in the entire universe. And even if you don't take the clinical philosophical approach about the sanctity and value of human life, at least the emotional human side of loving your own flesh and blood ought compel you to make damn sure you did your best job raising them. But as we've seen with other types of boomers, it's often the ones who were supposed to love you the most, or at least the ones you could trust, who are the ones to hurt you the most. And sadly, parent boomers were no exception. This isn't to say that parent boomers didn't love their children or were actively abusive. Parent boomers, like all boomers, can run the gamut from absolutely great and amazing people to the most vile and despicably evil people possible. But the real issue is not whether parent boomers loved their children, as most of them did at some level. It's whether parent boomers loved their children more than anything else. And it is here we find most parent boomers' love for their children was secondary, even tertiary, to those same four ulterior motives that drove most other boomer behavior. Laziness and fear of work and toil, self-love, profit, and politics. And nowhere is this more apparent than in boomer parents tacitly refusing to raise their own children. Outsourcing your children. There are many ways in which most boomer parents, and nearly all parents today, abdicated their responsibility of raising their children. But the most common and damaging one was by outsourcing their children to daycare. Let us be perfectly clear. Outsourcing your children to daycare is the defining act you don't love them most in life. If you wanted to have children, then why didn't you raise them? The act alone of leaving your toddler or infant with a stranger to raise them is proof you only wanted to have a kid, not be a mother or father. And it doesn't matter what feminists say, what parents say, or what self-proclaimed family experts say. It only matters what parent boomers did. And in shipping their children off to daycare, they made the clear and unmistakable proclamation that they loved themselves and their careers more than they did their children. Still, in the face of this black and white act, parents will defend their choice to outsource their children. But if you critically look at every noble excuse parent boomers, and modern-day ones, will give you as to why they did so, it only digs their hole deeper, as it's even more evidence their children were secondary to more important things in their lives. The most common retort from parent boomers is they couldn't afford children under a single income, thus both parents had to work. But this is a canard on two fronts. One, if you can't afford to have one parent stay at home to raise the children, then that is nature telling you you shouldn't have any. Having the finances necessary to have a parent stay at home to raise your children would be the ultimate financial prerequisite to having a child. But many boomer parents did not care whether they could actually afford to raise a child, let alone would drag it through childhood poverty. It was more important to them to have a child, thus relegating the child to more of an object than a human being to raise. Second, it is a bold-faced lie you need two incomes to support a family. It's merely an issue of priorities. When doing research for a separate project, I compared the budget of a U.S. family of 5 from 1955 to today. And it was very clear why you need two incomes today. Americans spend thrice the inflation-adjusted money. The 1950s were not magical. They were frugal. There was usually one car, and the husband took the bus to work. Wifey Poo didn't get a luxury Range Rover to go to her nail appointments. The house was 1/3 the square footage they are today where Wally and the Beeve shared a bunk bed, not a palatial McMansion estate where each kid got their own room. The 1950s family also didn't travel to Europe, financing the purchase with a home equity line with money they didn't have. They piled in the station wagon and drove to Yellowstone, or maybe Disney World if they were lucky. And moms in the 50s didn't saddle the family budget with $100,000 in student loans and $700 a month payment for a master's in sociology. They clipped coupons and stretched the family dollar. Boomer parents could have easily afforded a one-income home. They simply chose not to because they valued things more than their own children. But even if their excuse wasn't an issue of finances, parent boomers often plainly and blatantly stated that they loved their career and themselves more than their children, particularly among baby boomer women and their views of being a stay-at-home mom. Hillary Clinton perhaps stated it best when she said, "I suppose I could have stayed home and baked cookies and had teas, but what I decided to do was fulfill my profession." She received a lot of guff for that statement, but just as much praise and accolades among boomer moms, as well as moms today. She also belied her true motive. Her career, not her family, came first in life. Regardless, so unstigmatized and normalized has daycare become that ever since the 70s, mothers didn't even try to hide their love for their career, themselves, even the religion of feminism, over that of their children. Some even bragged about it, going so far as to call for government-funded daycare, which means they valued working over being a mother so much they wanted the taxpayer to raise their millennial children. One might argue that perhaps young mom boomers didn't know what they were doing or saying, misled by feminism to place more value on their careers than their children. But all that ultimately mattered to their millennial children was that mom wasn't there. And then there were the public schools. On two major accounts, boomer parents outsourced their millennial children to the state through the public schools. One through programs like Head Start, preschool, and pre-K. Two through before and after school programs that were just taxpayer-funded babysitting. Though ostensibly intended to give kids a head start, the real purpose of these programs was to allow both boomer parents to work without having to pay for a babysitter. And while this certainly worked, it came at the cost of spending time with their kids and forming an actual family. And so, instead of having sit-down meals with breakfast and dinner, parent boomers at most would spend time with their kids chauffeuring them from one school program to another, not even noticing their children growing up. When it was all said and done, teachers would spend 76% more time with your average millennial child than their own parents. But at least both parents got promoted to management at work and saved a bundle on babysitting. Materialism. Another example where millennial children played second fiddle to the ulterior desires and wants of parent boomers was materialism. We alluded to this before when it came to parents valuing their careers over their children, but parent boomers' materialism is much more complex and nuanced than that. It can be blatantly obvious, where there's no doubt they love money more than they do their own children. But it can be very subtle, where even the parents themselves don't realize deep down inside they value things more than their children, perhaps even viewing their children as objects themselves. But regardless of where they viewed their children on this spectrum, their children were usually subservient to status, material items, or even money. On the more blatant side were instances where the parents only used their children for money. Unfortunately, I've had more than one young man approach me who wished to go to college or attend the military to escape his impoverished home. And in both cases, the problem they faced was their mother would disown them, as she would get less of a Section 8 housing allowance if they were to leave home. There were also a handful of clients whose parents would use their child's social security number to open up, and then never pay back, credit cards, of which my clients would not know about until they applied for a credit card as an adult, which led them to consult me in the first place. Such things are not so much blatant materialism as they are child abuse. Threatening to disown your child because he wants to go and improve himself and that would cost you your precious government gimme-dats is only proof you never loved your son. You only viewed him as an ATM. Or stealing your children's social security number so you can have a 6-month spending spree is proof your parents viewed you as a host to parasite upon and nothing else. But the real cowardice is banking on your child's genetic programming to not only love but need their parents, and pitting that against their own self-interest as you ruin them financially forever. Admittedly, most parents would never stoop so low as to abuse their children for financial gain or steal from them. Additionally, most of those instances mentioned were Gen Xers and only 2 boomers. But boomer parents were still masters at using their children as objects for financial gain, specifically as chess pieces, and the game they were playing was divorce. Here, there is absolutely no denying that some parent boomers put their financial interests ahead of their children. And not only financial interests, but something as petty as getting revenge on their ex. The horror stories we've all heard when parents got divorced shows you how quickly the mature adult behavior is thrown out the window, and how quickly a millennial kid is turned into a weapon to extract as much money and pain out of an ex as possible. Be it trying to gain custody for child support, lying in court about what the ex had done, even being so petty as to drive 16 hours to prevent your ex from having your kid on the day he wasn't supposed to have him. All of that was indisputable proof that some parents only viewed their child as a tool to make money with, as well as extract a toll of revenge. It doesn't need to be stated here that divorce hurts children, because it technically doesn't. It's petty, vindictive parents who love their child support check more than their child that hurts them. Then there was having children as if they were things. The parents may not have been divorced. They may have been perfectly happy. But the kids were not so much children they needed to raise as much as they were an item to check off their to-do list. This was and is very common among double-income households. Because once again, if you can't afford to have one parent stay at home, then you can't afford children. But this doesn't stop many parent boomers from breeding anyway, because it wasn't a sentient human life they were bringing into existence. It was just a child. It was just a thing. Besides, I want a child, and that is all that matters. Alas, these kids were part of a lifestyle, not a family. These kids I like to call SUV kids, because that's precisely how their parents viewed them, as a nice luxury item. They really didn't spend time with the kid, they really didn't put much effort into it, and oftentimes they'd hire a nanny to raise it, because in the end, the child was merely a familial mantelpiece, a status symbol, a scratching of the biological itch to pass on their genetics, but certainly nothing to spend time raising or loving. And though it is not as bad as outright stealing from a child, it's painful in a different way, because it's confusing. Millennial children of two-income households likely had every material want and desire satisfied, so if asked what was wrong, they wouldn't be able to objectively say, because empirically it looked as if they had everything in life, even their parents. Which they did. It's just that they didn't have any love or parenting to go with their parents, or all the other nice things in the house. Too lazy and cowardly to parent. I was attending a charity event and found myself talking with a boomer couple and their 20-something daughter. The topic of conversation was their other daughter, who could not attend as she lived out of state. Though she was pushing 30, she was still having trouble finding herself and still relied on the financial support of her parents. But I could tell by the rolling eyes of the younger daughter that it was the parents' handouts that was the problem, not the solution, as it was simply enabling her older sister to continue her parasitic lifestyle. They knew I was an economist, so they asked for my advice. And I said, cut her off cold turkey, totally, now. But the mother said something very interesting. Oh no, I just couldn't do that. She's my baby. And so I left it at that, as I knew there was nothing I could do. But that statement really needs to be dissected, because it is everything wrong with boomer parenting, and parenting today. Because while on the face of it, it seemed the mother just wanted what was best for her child, in reality she was a lazy and cowardly mother, who clearly loved herself more than her own child. The real reason the mother, and father, continued to financially support their adult child daughter is not because they loved her. It's because of fear. Fear of the toil and suffering that comes with being a real parent. And not only were they too lazy to parent, but they were cowards on top of it, afraid of the confrontational conversation they would have to have with their daughter to set her on the path of adulthood. This is why they forked over the monthly stipend to their daughter, because it spared them the discomfort and pain of having an uncomfortable conversation. And so, if you think about it clearly, they literally feared the discomfort of having that necessary conversation more than they loved their daughter. Because if they really loved their daughter more than themselves, they would gladly suffer that minor pain to ensure her future would be better in the long run. This is everything that was wrong with boomer parenting. Laziness and cowardice. Parenting is hard. And the fear of things that are hard is what drives all laziness. But some parent boomers had a solution that would satisfy their desire to have children, but not suffer the pain and toil that would come with properly raising a kid. They would half-ass it. Specifically, they would choose the aspects of parenting they liked to do and avoid the ones they didn't. It would be all carrots, no sticks. All good cops, no bad. All cake, no Brussels sprouts. All timeouts, no spanking. All motherly love, no tough fatherly love. And the millennials would pay dearly. The reason they would pay is because the real world was not all cake, carrots, good cops, positive feelings, puppies, and unicorns. It wasn't the utopia Professor Boomers insisted it must be, and it wasn't the namby-pamby bullshit your elementary school teachers told you it should be. The real world was tough, unfair, vicious, Machiavellian, conniving, evil, and opportunistic. And in shirking their parental duties by raising a generation of children under this pie-in-the-sky lie, with absolutely no tough love that would prepare them for the real world, boomer parents sent their children into the world defanged, declawed, and completely clueless. The quintessential example of this is the education bubble. I personally do not know why it is so hard to sit a child down and have a reality-based conversation about how galactically stupid it is to spend $250,000 on a history degree at Middlebury. I don't understand why you can't just tell your daughter, no, I'm not paying for your communications degree at BFU. But parent boomers just could not get themselves to grow a pair and warn their millennial children about the absolutely horrible decisions they were making when it came to choosing a degree. Perhaps it was because the millennials had nothing else to live for than their degree. Perhaps K-12 education was such a prison that college became a promised land birthright to them. And so, parents just didn't have the spine to destroy their children's dream of majoring in journalism, no matter how much of a poverty-stricken nightmare that would turn out to be. Whatever the parent boomer excuse was, they failed to prevent their children from borrowing $1.5 trillion for completely worthless degrees. And their cowardice to be forthright with their kids destroyed the financial lives of millions of millennials. Another example is careers. Parent boomers lied to their millennial children, telling them they could do anything and be anything. Follow your heart and the money will follow. If you find a job you love, you won't work a day in your life. Do what you're passionate about. But none of this Disneyland bullshit has any anchoring in the real world. It's just something parents tell their children to be nice and avoid bursting their children's delusional dreams about easy and fun jobs. Therefore, in lying to children about finding a job they were passionate about, parent boomers damned their children to malinvest in careers that were low-paying and could barely support a single person, let alone a family. Journalism, professional activism, teaching, social work, being an artist, etc. Worse, they convinced their millennial children they were entitled to careers in these fields, regardless of whether or not there was any economic demand for them. So, instead of people willingly paying their children $100 an hour to code or perform surgery, parent boomers turned their children into white-collar panhandlers who would perpetually beg, often demand, charities and taxpayers fund what was in reality their low-paying hobbies. Once again, the fear of having an uncomfortable conversation about real-world economics outranked the concern parent boomers had for most of their millennial children. Then there is perhaps the most important thing in a human's life, something you'd think your parents would try to prepare you for, or equip you to attain in life. Love. The truth about women is that they want a strong man with adequate resources and income, who is in shape and can fight off any threats to them or their family, who will stand up to her instead of being a doormat, who will step up, make decisions, and lead, and who is tall. The truth about men is they want a woman with long hair, big boobs, who isn't fat, who is nice, who supports him instead of nags or questions him, who doesn't have another man's child, and who doesn't have $150,000 in student loans. In the past, it was largely the father's responsibility to explain these real-world realities of the opposite sex to his children. He would take his son aside and explain to him that he needed to go to the gym, become physically strong, learn a well-compensated skill or trade, become charming in some capacity or another, and make sacrifices for his would-be wife and children. He would also take his daughter aside and explain to her the true nature of men, what to look out for, and how to spot a quality man. He would also explain to his daughter that men primarily sought youth and beauty, and not to squander hers as it was her single greatest asset when it came to attracting a man. And if the father was particularly wise, he would tell both his sons and daughters that the most important thing in life was not their career or their education, but the love of their future spouse and children. Today, we can see just how much fathers have failed. Millennial men are effeminate, timid, androgynous pussies that might as well sell their wives and children into slavery if they manage to have either. They have no direction, no ambition, and no tolerance for pain. They are listless, not leaders, and take on whatever shape society, and women, tell them to. And most of them can barely support themselves, let alone a family. It is perfectly understandable why millennial women can't find a man. But millennial women are no prize either. They are obese, loud, entitled, and simply the antithesis of feminine. They cannot shut up about their careers, their politics, or feminism, even though nobody asked them. Worse, they are not fun, receptive, loving, or warm. They are a chore, a lecture, a sermon, a confrontation, a shrew you'd choose not to tame. And this says nothing about the liabilities they'd become in terms of their student loans, kids from other men, their proclivity to divorce, and the rare but still too common false rape accusation. It should be no shock, then, why millennials not only have such trouble dating, but are completely uninspired to do so. The sexes have become worthless to each other. Neither men nor women have been trained to put forth the effort and sacrifice to become what a potential loved one would want. And in failing this, millennial men have retreated into their video games and porn, while millennial women have retreated to their careers and smartphones. The absence of tough, fatherly love has ruined a generation of men for women and women for men. And in shirking their duties, boomer fathers cost their millennial children the most important thing of all: love. There are many other instances where laziness and cowardice trumped boomers' love for their millennial children. Parents rarely taught their kids about personal finances, homeownership, or retirement. If millennials wanted to learn how to fix a car or repair a computer, they'd have a better chance looking it up on YouTube than having their dad show them. If their children were tortured or bullied in school, rarely would parents consider homeschooling. And there is, of course, the aforementioned doping your kids up with drugs for mental disorders they likely didn't have, all to excuse bad parenting. The larger point is that beyond birthing, food, clothing, and shelter, many parent boomers did nothing to invest in their children. They did nothing to prepare their children for the real world. They may have fed them and sheltered them, but no wisdom, philosophy, guidance, or context was provided to paint a clear life path for their children. And even if there was a path that was painted, it was heavily skewed toward an unrealistic idealism, simply because it was easier than a path painted in reality, hardship, and tough fatherly love. There's a reason they offer adulting classes to millennials. It's because their fathers chose not to prepare them for adulthood. Divorce. While the above accusations are certainly up for debate, there is no debate whatsoever that the parent boomers had an outright monopoly on divorce. And it doesn't matter which way you cut it, divorce is nothing more than legal child abuse. It is understood that sometimes you choose the wrong partner, and for the safety of yourself and the children, you need to divorce them. But like claiming you needed 2 incomes to raise a family, when you critically dissect the excuses parents give for getting divorced, you truly see how lowly ranked their children were in their lives. The first and most obvious one is that divorce is what's in the best interests of the family. I attended a school with a girl whose family seemed to be the perfect family. She and her brother were straight-A students. Both parents were well-compensated professionals and good-standing members of the community. The kids were also great kids, active athletes, and once again, good students. But it wasn't until I graduated from college that I heard that her parents broke up. And not only did they break up, but unbeknownst to everyone, they had been divorced the past 10 years, even dating other people while they acted like they were still married. The reason they kept up the facade was for the sake of their children. They did not want to harm or hurt their children until they had all grown up and left the house. And so they made the incredible sacrifice of living a good lie for the benefit of their children. To this day, this is the only instance of acceptable divorce I have ever heard, aside from ones where the family's safety was threatened, because the parents truly put their children ahead of themselves. This is not the case for pretty much all the other parent boomers who got divorced. Instead of acknowledging that their children came first and choosing to put on a show for the mental sake of their children, most parent boomers got divorced because their intolerance for one another was more powerful than the love for their children. If parents really loved their children most, and assuming there was no threat to the family from one of the spouses, the only logical solution would be to do precisely what my classmates' parents did. Shut the fuck up, put up with one another, maintain a stable nuclear family, grind your teeth and suffer, because you made the mistake of bringing children into an unstable home, not the other way around. But as evidenced by how popular it was for parent boomers to get divorced, you once again see where most of their loyalties lied. A second way you can tell just how lowly millennial children ranked in the lives of parent boomers was the provably poor partner selection parent boomers had. With half of boomer marriages ending in divorce, you were just as likely to pick the right partner by flipping a coin. But this didn't prevent women from breeding willy-nilly with men that in the end they'd divorce anyway. Of course, this didn't mean women actively chose between being happy by getting a divorce and their children, as their children were yet to be. But it does show incredibly poor screening on their part when it came to choosing a mate, and thus how little thought many mom boomers gave when it came to bringing innocent lives into this world. Perhaps they were full of puppy love. Perhaps it was the mere throes of passion, and certainly there may have been some alcohol involved. But many millennials were brought into existence with no more thought than, I think this guy might be the one, or worse, I didn't pull out in time. A third way to tell your parents loved themselves more than you is if they never got divorced. This is at first confusing, as you would think parents never divorcing would be a good thing. But if they never got married in the first place, then they very well couldn't have gotten divorced now, could they? Cheekiness aside, roughly 25% of millennials were born out of wedlock. And while marriage may be what stuffy Ward and June Cleaver did in those outdated 50s, a nuclear family is absolutely necessary for the proper raising of children. No matter what feminists and the Democratic Party say, children need both their parents. Period. Still, many baby mamas and baby daddies valued themselves and their freedom more than they did their children. So much so, they'd rather have a child grow up in a broken home than marry somebody they weren't too sure about. And so many parents brought their children to term, thinking they could raise the child by themselves. The problem with single-parent households is it's more or less a lifelong torture session for the kid. Children from broken homes have thrice the rates of alcoholism, drug abuse, crime, divorce, bankruptcy, STDs, mental illness, and all other sorts of societal ills. The life of a bastard child is horrible. Still, baby mamas and baby daddies nightclubbing was more important than their child's well-being. So they couldn't let a kid crimp their style by getting tied down to the mother/father. Good thing you had grandma and grandpa to raise you. Consequences. There are two major consequences for parent boomers shirking their parental duties. 1. Millennials had their lives ruined. A kid cannot start out as an infant, raise itself, and then become a successful adult. It doesn't have the knowledge or ability to teach itself, and is 100% dependent on its elders to provide the wisdom and guidance needed to succeed in the real world. But the problem is much, much worse than that. It's an issue of garbage in, garbage out. Because the millennials weren't abandoned. They weren't orphaned. It's not like their parents didn't invest trillions in their education, shrink bills, and after-school activities. They were misinformed. They were misled. They were propagandized. They were lied to. This is infinitely worse than being left alone, because at least if left to their own devices and logic, they would have stood a 50-50 shot at deducing what the real world was actually like. But in lying to them, intentionally or not, boomer elders sabotaged the millennials' futures, guaranteeing they would at best squander their youth, if not waste their entire lives. This put millennials in an impossible situation today, because not only do millennials need to deprogram themselves from their erroneous programming, reprogram themselves based on the real world, while, hopefully, salvaging what they have left on this planet, but they also have to first admit they're wrong and don't know what they're talking about. And the millennial political mind virus is so well entrenched in the millennial generation that only a very precious few of them actually have the critical thinking skills to shuck it. This means a metaphorical death sentence for most millennials, as they are doomed to never wake up from the Matrix, guaranteeing the last half of their lives will be as pointless as the first. 2. Whether millennials wake up or not, they're going to blame their failures and misery in life on the only people they can: their elders. And since it was their parents who were most responsible for their upbringing, their parents will bear the brunt of this blame. This has already happened with millennials dismissing their parents' generation with the OK Boomer hashtag and a general disrespect for boomers across the country. But it will likely get worse. Namely, millennials will want to have nothing to do with their parents. Not only because they likely can't afford to visit the family, or are too busy just trying to make ends meet, but because their parent boomers lied to them. They did a piss-poor job of parenting. And intentional or not, once the millennials figure this out, there will be a lot of lonely baby boomers in the nursing homes, if they're lucky enough to be put in one at all. This is the lesson not just parent boomers, but all of us need to learn. The pursuit of the easy life, the easy way out, or just half-assing life, comes at a great cost. Perhaps the greatest cost: loved ones. Because if you love yourself so much, or are such a coward you cannot suffer or sacrifice for others, then you are not only incapable of love, but also incapable of being loved. Sure, you might be able to fool some people for a while. Sure, your children are biologically and financially compelled to love you for their first few years of life. But in the long run, your true, selfish, and self-serving colors will come out. And while your early days may have been easy, perhaps even filled with material wealth as you shirked your duties to others, you will have no one of any quality or caliber in your life, as it will become very apparent where your ulterior motivations laid.